This is Barry Zalma speaking for Claim School Incorporated's blog, Zalma on Insurance. Today we're going to speak about why a homeowner's policy does not cover the insured's business pursuits and why the Supreme Court of Connecticut ruled that business pursuits exclusion in a homeowner's policy defeats the insured's claim for indemnity. In a declaratory judgment action to determine whether the plaintiffs were obligated to defend and indemnify the named defendant under certain insurance policies for damages awarded against the named defendant in a separate action, where the court denied the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment and granted the motion for summary judgment filed by the named defendant as to the duty to defend under the policies. In Nationwide Mutual versus Jeffrey F. Pasiak et al., the Supreme Court of Connecticut on February 21, 2023, was faced with the request by Nationwide to apply its business pursuits exclusion and eliminate the need of Nationwide to pay indemnity to its insured. This case reached the Supreme Court of Connecticut for the second time, following lengthy litigation of a declaratory judgment action brought by the plaintiffs, Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company and Nationwide Mutual Fire Insurance Company, against the defendant Jeffrey S. Pasiak. The action concerned whether the plaintiffs were obliged to indemnify the defendant, a business owner, under a personal umbrella insurance policy for liability arising from his false imprisonment of his company's employee at her workplace. The trial court rendered judgment for the plaintiffs, concluding that they have no obligation to indemnify the defendant, who, of course, appealed for a second time. The defendant owned Pasiak Construction Services, LLC, which had its sole office in the defendant's home in Stamford, Connecticut. The defendant maintained a homeowner's insurance policy and an umbrella insurance policy through the plaintiffs at the time of the incident. He did not hold any commercial liability insurance for his business. Pasiak Construction employed Sara Socci as a part-time office manager with working hours of 9:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. 4 days a week. Socci worked out of the office in the defendant's home and would help with both the defendant's business tasks and personal tasks. One day, in May 2006, Socci was working at her desk when an individual entered the office wearing a mask and carrying a gun. The individual demanded that Socci show him to the defendant's safe and open it. Socci had no knowledge of the safe or its combination. The individual became enraged, and he bound, gagged, and blindfolded Socci and forced her down on the floor of the bedroom. He put a gun to her head and told her he would kill her and her family if she did not open the safe that she didn't even know existed. The defendant eventually returned home and was attacked by the individual at the top of the stairs. The defendant, Pasiak, was eventually able to unmask the individual, revealing his identity to be Richard Kotulski, a longtime friend of Pasiak. When the defendant asked about Socci's whereabouts, Kotulski led him to the bedroom where the defendant made Kotulski untie Socci. The defendant and Kotulski reached some degree of resolution of their dispute and ended up speaking amicably. Despite Socci's request to leave, the defendant, Pasiak, prevented her from leaving. Following Kotulski's exit, Socci resigned from Pasiak Construction and informed the defendant that she would no longer work for him because she was terrified that Kotulski would return. The trial court also noted that she felt intimidated because the defendant and Kotulski were each twice as large as she was. Socci, her husband, and a friend later returned to the defendant's home, at which point the defendant called the police. After being charged with kidnapping in the second degree and witness tampering, the defendant pleaded guilty under the Alford doctrine to charges of interfering with an officer and threatening in the second degree. Socci and her husband sued the defendant, alleging false imprisonment, negligence, intentional, reckless, and negligent infliction of emotional distress, and loss of consortium. The plaintiffs provided the defendant with an attorney to defend him in the Socci action, but notified him that they were reserving their right to contest coverage. The plaintiffs nationwide then sued, seeking a declaration they had no duty to defend or indemnify the defendant in the Socci action. The trial court concluded by way of summary judgment that the allegations of the complaint were sufficiently broad to obligate the plaintiffs to provide the defendant with a defense under his homeowner and umbrella insurance policies, but the court deemed it improper at that juncture to determine the plaintiff's duty to indemnify, because the duty to defend is broader than the duty to indemnify. Socci and the defendant proceeded to trial in the tort action, in which the jury awarded Socci $628,200 in compensatory damages and $175,000 in punitive damages. The jury also awarded Socci's husband $32,500 in compensatory damages. The plaintiffs then filed a second motion for summary judgment in the declaratory judgment action regarding their duty to indemnify Pasiak. The plaintiffs agreed, among other things, that the defendant's policies did not cover his liability for the Socci action because coverage was barred under the policy exclusion for business pursuits. The court concluded that the plaintiffs were entitled to summary judgment under the homeowner's insurance policy, which did not cover injury for emotional distress unless caused by a physical injury, but not under the umbrella insurance policy, which covered personal injury, defined to include the false imprisonment. The trial court issued a decision and rendered judgment for the defendant, requiring the plaintiffs to indemnify the defendant for his liability in the Socci action. The Supreme Court reversed the judgment with direction to remand the case to the trial court for a new trial on the business pursuits exclusion issue. The trial court concluded in its second hearing that the plaintiffs satisfied their burden by a preponderance of the evidence and issued a judgment in favor of Nationwide. There is always a distinction between the standard of proof in a civil trial and the interpretive presumptions the Supreme Court applies to insurance contracts. The interpretation of an insurance contract is always a question of law, not a matter of fact. No one questioned that the activities of Pasiak Construction met the two elements of a business pursuit, nor does anyone contend that false imprisonment constitutes a business pursuit. Therefore, the question is whether the defendant's false imprisonment of Socci arose out of his business pursuits in operating Pasiak Construction. The Supreme Court concluded that it was sufficient to show only that the accident or injury was connected with, had its origins in, grew out of, flowed from, or was incident to the specified subject, his business pursuits, in order to meet the requirement that there be a causal relationship between the accident or injury and the subject of business pursuits. the Supreme Court concluded that the defendant's remaining claims were without merit, and the judgment of the trial court should be affirmed. Specifically, the Supreme Court concluded that 1. The trial court did not err when it found that the plaintiffs favor on the basis that they failed to produce new credible evidence that was not raised during the first trial, and 2. With respect to the second and third claims, the record viewed as a whole contained evidence that supported the factual findings of the trial court. And therefore, in conclusion, the Supreme Court of Connecticut found that the trial court properly applied the preponderance of the evidence standard at the trial de novo to determine the factual question of whether the plaintiffs established that the pursuits exclusion of the umbrella insurance policy barred coverage. It did, and the judgment was affirmed. In my opinion, a construction company seeking insurance protection usually, if not always, needs a commercial general liability policy to protect its commercial interests. A homeowner's policy, like that issued by Nationwide and the umbrella over it, are designed to protect against the liability faced by a homeowner, not a business, and exclude coverage for business pursuits. In this case, as part of the defendant's business, a jury found he wrongfully imprisoned his employee and caused her and her husband tort damages. The exclusion applied, and the insurer was not required to indemnify the insured, although it was required to defend him and his company to the allegations of the employee's suit. The insured, Pasiak Construction, intentionally caused damage to an employee, falsely imprisoned her, and she had been abused by a friend of Pasiak, who held her at gunpoint and threatened to kill her and her family. Pasiak got more than he deserved with a full, paid-for defense. I expect Pasiak will file bankruptcy to avoid paying the judgment, unless he has come into a great deal of money and is capable of paying almost $1 million to his ex-employee. This video was adapted from my blog, Zelma on Insurance, which is available free to anyone who clicks on the URL zelma.com/blog. If you found the blog useful, you might wish to subscribe so that you can be advised of each blog posting, usually 5 a week, sometimes more. And you can also subscribe to the videos at YouTube and rumble.com. If you found the videos and or the blog posting to be useful, please tell your friends and colleagues so that they can also read the blog posting, view the videos, and subscribe so that they can also take advantage of the more than 600 videos I've posted on rumble.com and the more than 450 blog postings. Thank you for your attention.